I think most photographers think of double exposures as some sort of gimmick or like party trick. But personally, I see them as a valuable storytelling tool that can potentially help make an image stronger or more eye-catching. And now, they're not everybody's cup of tea, but maybe after watching this video, you might be more interested in the potential of multiple exposure photography. When I'm thinking about what a double exposure is, I'm thinking about double exposures made in camera. Basically where you take the first image and then you take the second image and they're blended together on the spot, not in Photoshop. And nothing against a Photoshop double exposure, but I just don't find them as fun or satisfying personally. But now to do an in-camera double exposure, you need specific kinds of equipment. Now these specific kinds of equipment aren't uncommon necessarily, but you gotta know what can and what can't do a double exposure. Digital cameras that offer an in-camera double exposure option are like Nikon and Canon and Fujifilm. All of those models of camera have a feature inside of them where you can click double exposure, shoot the first image, shoot the second image, third, fourth, fifth, up to ninth in some cases, and it will blend the images together for you in the camera so you can see the final product on your screen when you look at all your photos. Sony, I'm shooting this video on a Sony a7 IV. Sony does not offer that feature, which is a bummer, which is why I don't use my Sony for anything but video and some client work at this point. Now, for film, an in-camera double exposure is a pretty simple concept. In fact, many people do them on accident sometimes. Basically, it's the idea you shoot a photo on a shot of film, and then you shoot it again and again and again on the same film frame. And so the only way that's not possible is if you're using like a point and shoot that auto advances the film, or a film camera that doesn't let you take the next shot until you advance the frame. There are a lot of film cameras that allow you to shoot without advancing the frame. My Nikon FE, which I talked about in a previous video, is one of those where it has a little trigger where you pull that when you advance and it doesn't move the film forward. My Yashica Mat TLR, for instance, all you got to do is recock the shutter and then you can take another shot. So those are cameras that make it really easy. My Nikon N65 has a digital readout where I can set it to double exposure mode so that the camera knows not to advance the film. So you just need to make sure you have a camera that allows you to shoot without advancing the film. And some cameras don't. Point and shoots largely are guilty of not allowing you to do that, with some exceptions, which we will talk about later in this video. So let's get into it. Here's how I think of different types of double exposures and how they can be used to strengthen the narrative of an image. So let's start off by talking about the most common version of double exposures that you see or think of when you think of the double exposure technique, and that's double exposures that are built around form. And this is a pretty simple idea. You take one image that is formally interesting and you take a second image that's formally interesting and you combine them to make another formally interesting thing. If you search Pinterest right now for double exposures, that's most of what you would see. You would see what I call the flowers and heads type of double exposures, where you see a human silhouette of some kind superimposed with a second image. And a lot of them, you know, it's hard to tell for those whether they were made in Photoshop or in camera. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. It's truthfully whether the image is strong or not. But basically the idea is taking a common form and combining it with another to kind of enhance or tell a greater story about a thing. My senior art project in college was around this technique. Basically, I used human silhouettes around locations, and they were pretty simplistic at the time. I've since gotten more complex in my work since making that series, but it was built around the idea of people. And then I had moved from Hawaii, so I was fascinated with the different places and textures that were in the mainland US. So some of them were in the snow, and some of them were at the beach, and some of them were in the woods or mountains, and they were all human silhouettes against some sort of elementally based background. But my first few were obviously photos with, you know, heads with flowers or botanicals in them. And I think the reason they tend to be common and you see these more often is because they are undeniably cool and striking. I think we are naturally predisposed to like the human shape. So when we see a human and shape mixed with something else, we're interested in looking at it. And so my first crack at these were shot on my Nikon D7000 back in the day, all in camera, because the D7000 also had an in-camera double exposure feature back in 2012, 13. So if you're getting into double exposures, this is a great way to figure out kind of how they work. Basically, the way double exposures work is they live in the shadows, like Batman. And what I mean by that is basically whatever you shoot in the first image, if it has a lot of shadow, where the shadows are is where the second image or third image will appear in the first image. So that's why people like human silhouettes. So basically what you do is you take your subject and put them up against a super bright backdrop so that they are in shadow, but behind them is bright, and then your double exposure will be contained within their silhouette. And so it's a simple idea, and it's a good way to practice to understand and almost predict what kind of images you will be creating when you do the double exposure technique. Once you get used to the idea of looking for the shadows and how that will interact with the second image, it'll help you to use other type of double exposure techniques and understand kind of where everything's going to land. Chaos and double exposures is quickly becoming one of my favorite techniques when thinking about double exposures. Basically, the idea is like what it sounds like. Go wild. Sometimes that means me walking around in a place, and I did this recently in Manhattan Beach, California. Walk around and just take interesting frames and just smash them together. Just smashing exposures together randomly without thinking about where the shadows are or whatever, just to see what the result is. And on film, that adds an extra surprise than the one you already get from getting your film developed. That feeling gets doubled when you stumble upon a shot that was just completely at random, really amazing, and maybe created some possibilities I didn't even consider. Another way that I've been implementing chaos in double exposures is with a point and shoot film camera. So a second ago, I talked about how with point and shoots, you can't really do a double exposure, but you actually can. You just can't do it in a very controlled way. And so basically what that means is you can shoot over the roll. And I've talked about this before. I have multiple videos on this subject. Basically, you shoot over a roll once and then you shoot over it again. And as long as you line up the frames, you'll have some cool images that you would have never thought of. So one example of that is when I shot the woods here in South Carolina and then took that roll of film and shot over it in New York City. And the buildings over the woods just created a vibe and texture and shapes that I just couldn't have shot with full control. I just had to let chaos take over. One way to shoot chaotic double exposures on digital would be to just go to a crazy place and just shoot all the things, lights, textures going on, and just smash them all together, and they can end up looking like a cool abstract painting. So I've got one to show you actually, but I'm shooting this in black and white, so I'm gonna have to switch to color real quick. Okay, so here it is. You may recognize this from the 2.5D printing video, but basically this is a photo I shot in an arcade, a double exposure in camera, and I just went the chaos route where I just kind of let everything get in frame and like really just crazy. And so you'll notice on this particular print, there's actual texture in the print itself because I printed it in 2.5D, so which again, that video, I'll put it in the description if you want to watch my 2.5D printing video. But yeah, so this would be a great example of chaos, but with digital double exposures. Now, the benefit of film over digital is obviously you can take your time. So you can shoot a bunch in one location, get on a plane and fly to New York City and shoot them in a different location. With digital, like the one I just showed you, well, I haven't really found a digital double exposure feature that doesn't time out after a while and kind of cut you off from shooting the next one. So with digital, your chaotic double exposures are a little time sensitive as well. Unlike film, where you can kind of, the sky's the limit. It's all manual. So there's a way that the limitations of each camera or method can enhance your double exposures. You just have to think about which one's best for what. Another interesting form of double exposure is what the kids refer to as vibes. And vibes are hard to define. I mean, by nature, the word is kind of a gushy word that helps you avoid being specific descriptively about something. And it's kind of a cop-out of a word. In fact, I probably should have come up with a better word than simply just vibes. But I think it's an interesting tool in the tool belt of somebody who likes to use double exposures. Basically, the idea behind vibes is it helps build up a story in our head. It builds up an essence around a thing. So when we think about something, the vibes heavily influence how we think about that thing. For instance, I don't think John Wick works without the neon gothic sort of look it has. There's a lot of bright colors, a lot of bright lights, just a lot of really striking scenes and compositions and colors and locations that I think you can't really separate from the John Wick franchise. And if you tried to make a John Wick movie look different, it wouldn't feel like John Wick anymore. The movie The Creator is something I saw recently, and while it has a lot of issues plot-wise, I think overall it leaves a good taste in people's mouths off vibes alone. So how can we use vibes in double exposure photography? Well, double exposure doesn't have to be the thing. So when you look at an image, often you look at a double exposure image, but it could just be an image with double exposure as the spice in the overall dish. Maybe the double exposure isn't the thing you see first. Maybe you see the subject, and then the double exposure adds some dreaminess to it, or maybe a sense of place, but not really, if that makes sense. They can highlight a feeling of a place more than show you the place. So one way to do that, and one way I often do that, is to think about your second image. And while the chaos method and the form method, you're combining two images that are perfect. They could potentially stand alone, basically. So with chaos, you're shooting two images that are compositionally good and strong and sharp on their own and smashing them together. In form, you're obviously focused on form, so you want to take two formally good images and combine them together to make an ultimate, a mega formally good image. But with a vibes method, you're kind of thinking about the first image primarily, and the second image is just meant to enhance the first image, but not take away from the first image. So one way to think about that is maybe shoot an image of a landscape, and then shoot the second image as like a long exposure light streak kind of thing. And so the second image probably couldn't stand alone. It just simply adds texture and magic to the first image. All your focus should really be on the first image, and then the second image could be out of focus, but it adds like a cloudy dreaminess around your first image. And so I shoot a lot of examples of that because I like surrealness. I like for a place to not really feel like a place, but still kind of feel like a place, if you know what I'm saying. And those work really well on film or digital because they're on the spot. There's no chaos or whatever. It's just you're trying to enhance the subject in front of you. And honestly, these kind of shots can work well with a digital in-camera double exposure feature or film. I prefer the look of film because I like the extra layer of grain and dreaminess film tends to add. Film tends to feel like a memory, but you can also get away with a lot with digital as well. I hope this video has helped break down some double exposure techniques that could be a tool in your tool belt for the future. I think that part of the reason people think of double exposures as gimmicky is because they're not getting super deep into them or really digging into the possibilities of double exposures. And ever since I got into them years ago, I really have just wanted to push and figure out all the different ways you can do it. I think what's interesting about double exposures is thinking about the results that come from double exposures and the different ways you can use double exposures to attain different goals in your photography. And so obviously sometimes it doesn't work. I don't shoot double exposures 100% of the time, but every once in a while I'm out there, I'm shooting a photo of a landscape or whatever, and I'm like, oh, I see it. I see how I could add an extra vibe to this image. Oh, I see chaos that could be created through double exposures. I see a form or a shape that could be reflected or twisted or turned around formally with double exposure. And each camera, each double exposure functionality, whether it's digital or film or a point and shoot camera or whatever, all of those come with their own creative constraints that help make the work, I think, more interesting. And quite honestly, I've been into double exposures for a while, and I haven't seen that many people dig that deeply into them in videos on YouTube and that kind of thing. So I'm hoping to add more of these kind of things to my channel as I go in the future, just because I want to put out what I want to see. I hope you got something out of this video. You can follow me on Instagram at Will Malone. You can follow my Polaroid account at RoidRage72. And please subscribe if you'd like to smash images together as chaotic double exposures.